Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. I'm joined today by Jarian Kerekes, who is the president of the Equitable Foundation. Jarian, welcome to Trending in Education.
It's awesome to be with you, Michael.
You're doing interesting work. We'll get into that in a bit. Before we do, we always like to start with your origin story, how you got to this point in your professional life. Can you catch us up on how you got to this point in your career?
Absolutely. I think, obviously my past has really shaped the work that I do now. I grew up in Blacksburg, Virginia. I consider that home. Some, challenging circumstances at times. I had a family that there was a lot of love, but not always a ton of guidance. Parents split up. It was really my dad raising myself and my brother. And we were just like surviving, and we didn't talk a lot about careers. We didn't talk a lot about what success was. And so a lot of my aspirations and things were maybe not as big and wide as maybe others who were having those conversations with their parents. But I was really fortunate to grow up in a town that was a little bit, for the older audience listening, Mayberry, right? You left your doors unlocked and everybody knew each other's names and shopped at the same places. Obviously, just a really privileged childhood from that standpoint, a really great town. And I had family friends that looked after me and I played sports. And so I did what those friends were doing.
Mhm.
And that was really cool because I was lucky enough to have really good friends, still to this day, my best friends. And I think through osmosis, just started thinking about college and started thinking about these things because their parents were involved and met some really awesome people that helped me get into college at Virginia Tech.
Go Hokies.
Go Hokies, absolutely. Flailed around a little bit because I had some poor habits, but was able to get through college and ultimately go to grad school. And I say this to every student I have the privilege of being with is going to college changed my life. It wasn't like a paper I wrote or a presentation, but it was just the people you're around and the
Yeah.
worldview. And I'm bullish on getting access to go to college. I think it's a surefire way to create economic and social mobility. And so that led me to grad school, led me into my first career, 10 years in sports marketing.
Nice.
Now, really, the last 12 years working in this corporate social responsibility, community impact space.
Right. And a couple different organizations along the way there, but then ultimately landing with Equitable and the Equitable Foundation. Can you describe what that is and what your mission is there?
Yeah, absolutely. So at Equitable, a company that's been around 165 years, we talk about being a force for good. Our business is helping people retire with dignity. It's life insurance. It's a really intentional focus on wealth management, employee benefits. And from a business standpoint, I have colleagues that are financial professionals in communities every day working with individuals on how to plan, save for retirement, and protect their assets, protect their families.
Mhm.
Holistically, a company that is really helping people. I obviously get the privilege of leading our foundation, which is a really intentional focus in communities. We focus on college and career readiness for students, huge area of focus, a huge area of focus around K through 12 educators, because in that wealth management side and in that retirement side, we've got financial professionals dedicated to working with K through 12 educators. We're the number one provider of 403B plans in the
Mm.
United States.
Mhm.
So my focus at the foundation aligns to the business in that we're supporting educators, whether it be professional development, teacher pipeline initiatives, and really focusing on their overall well-being, wellness.
Mhm.
And then the third area of focus, so I mentioned college and career readiness, the K through 12 support. It's really ensuring that we've got vibrant and healthy communities. And we do that through a myriad of things. And really the backbone of that is K through 12 education and students and ultimately teachers that feel great, feel supported, feel respected, and can pour into those students. And I think it all creates this flywheel of impact. And I've been really lucky to lead that work.
Yeah. And it's a lot of giving back, I guess, a lot of grants and scholarships and ways in which you're funding these positive initiatives. Can you maybe showcase a little bit of what's going on in your portfolio?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. So, philanthropy, obviously, dollars always help, but we also know from some of these deep rooted structural challenges that we have in many cities across our awesome country It's not money alone that solves these things. It's policies, it's advocacy. It takes a lot to get the thing moving in the right direction. So, yes, philanthropy is part of that grant making, but we try to be really intentional with our dollars. And so, intentional that they align to a focus area, intentional that it's not just relying upon a dollar or a grant, but that we can bring all of our big systems to bear, our leaders, our employee volunteers. I mentioned the advocacy, all that stuff kind of goes into that. So, grant making is a big piece of it. We have a very generous employee matching gift program that employees take advantage of to the tune of, $3.5 million a year going to different nonprofit organizations that they care about. They have
Mhm,
the opportunity to direct those funds. We match it from the foundation.
mhm,
And you mentioned scholarships. So that's a big area of focus is a scholarship program that we call Equitable Excellence. It's been in existence since 2003. We've helped over 7,300 scholars get access to post-secondary education,
mhm,
and it's a renewable scholarship. Last year, 71% of our recipients identified as BIPOC, Black,
mhm.
Indigenous, or people of color. It's a very
Yeah.
diverse scholarship, and we're really proud that over 60% of our scholars are first generation. So a lot of intentionality of ensuring that our scholarship program is reaching students that would benefit the most. Because if you take a deeper dive into the private scholarship ecosystem, unfortunately, less than 10% of that big $7 billion private scholarship industry is actually going to students that have financial need.
Mm.
And at Equitable Excellence, 100% of our scholarship recipients qualify for financial need. And that's really important to us.
Yeah. And then higher ed, you talked about it in a couple different ways, but it's a space that's been a little bit more fraught lately. The perception of higher ed, the challenges it's facing. Sometimes it's easy to lose sight of the fact that it is life changing and it can really open up social mobility, economic mobility in ways that really nothing else can. I'd be curious how you would characterize the current state of higher ed and how you think about that when you're trying to work with the folks you're helping.
It's a great question. And I think that's really where our partnership for the last 4 years with the National College Attainment Network really comes into view. They're leaders as it relates to policy, advocacy, supporting organizations that are working with students in communities to remove barriers and get on a path to a 2 or a 4 year degree.
Mhm.
What I say to that, and obviously the cost of higher education continues to climb, and that's something that needs to be addressed, I do believe. But where we spend a lot of time in many of the organizations that NCAN supports and is part of their member network, there is a deliberate focus on ensuring that students are finding their passions and that students are finding the right fit and the right choice. What happens and where this really can get out of control, and unfortunately was a little bit of my challenge, is like you go to go to college, and if you're not intentional or have a plan or know what you want to study and really are focused on like what are the courses that are going to set me up for success, then that's when you're just taking classes and borrowing money. And you're kind of like, you get out
Yeah,
of college, you've got a mound of debt. And what am I going to do with this career?
right.
And so that's where at Equitable, that's where a lot of the focus within CAN is. It's not just about removing barriers for students, but it's like, how do we provide supports and programs for students where they can explore the things that they may have an interest in and the things that make school enjoyable. And I talk about that a lot. It took me a while to find the things that I was passionate about, whether I wasn't having intentional conversations in high school, not paying attention. There's a lot of reasons for it. But I really say to students, you're in control of this. You know what type of subjects interest you and the type of things that maybe are a little more difficult. You want to start leaning into those things that you really find enjoyable, because that's going to get you on a path where you love school, you love turning in the work, you love being part of the conversation. And ultimately, you want to get to a point where you love going to work.
Mm,
And I know it sounds cliche, but I have a job that I get to do, not a job that I have to do. And that's what I want for everybody. You don't want to be staring at the clock at 5 o'clock. You don't want to be, Sunday scaries on Sunday. You're like worried about Monday. Like, every day I wake up so excited that I get to do this work and have impact in communities and bring others along. And that's what I want for other people as well.
Yeah. And a big part of that, I think, is finding your why, finding that mission, that vision, that way to give back that we were talking about before. I know volunteerism and community service, community engagement is very central to a lot of the work. Can you talk a little more about that?
It is. It's so important. And finding your why, I spent the first 11 years of my career in sports marketing. I had the privilege of working for a sports marketing agency, a Toyota NASCAR race team,
Mm,
working with Fortune 500 sponsors. And then I had an opportunity to go work at the National Basketball Association. Working for a global sports league really did change my life because it was at the NBA where I was working in our NBA Cares division, and we were working with global marketing partners to build programs in communities. And I got the opportunity to build basketball courts across the globe. I got an opportunity there to work with partners to build technology labs in under-resourced communities. I fell in love with it. And I saw the spark and the inspiration you could have on youth by saying, listen, I know you love the NBA. You only hope to be as lucky to hit the lottery and be as tall and fast and as skilled as LeBron James or Steph Curry. However, there are things that you learn through sports and through community that will help you in your career. And it was there where a light bulb went off for me where I felt like this is something that I want to do the rest of my life. And it doesn't have to be in sports. So I
mhm.
had the opportunity to get involved in financial services and obviously with Equitable the last 4.5 years. And you mentioned volunteerism. I think it's so important to any corporate citizenship. Many people can write a check or round up at the grocery store, but I think where true change happens is when you get a heart for it, when
Mm,
you go, you see it, you touch it. So we put a lot of emphasis on getting our colleagues out into the communities, not just the performative things or the check writing. That's important. But where change really happens is when you use your advocacy and your social capital to say, we can do better. We can lean into these issues to try to make a difference. And that's a really important part of the work I lead.
yeah. And then, the climate for some of this stuff, you mentioned, BIPOC and the populations you're trying to reach. That's now a little bit under the gun of late, with the new emphasis on DEI that's out there, like some of the attacks on DEI, which frankly I'm finding unsettling and surprising. I'd be curious how you're looking at that and how you're thinking about, really continuing to engage with these folks who need the help at a time where some of the supports that maybe they were expecting are under attack.
Yeah, it's a well-timed question. And I'll just tell you that as we were looking to transform our scholarship and really our focus in communities, it was always about helping those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, not a specific ethnicity.
Mhm.
That was never part of the equation. And I think that, you know, there are communities and I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, and there are folks from all walks of life, all races, genders that come from backgrounds where they're lacking economic and social mobility. Matter of fact, it was really about 10 years ago where Raj Chetty, a brilliant Harvard economist, said
Mm.
of the 50 major cities, Charlotte was 50 out of 50 as far as economic and social mobility. So if you were born into poverty,
Mm.
the chances of getting out of that situation really was insurmountable. And 10 years later, they've done a study just this summer they released, and Charlotte's moved up to 30 out of 50.
Mm.
By no means does Equitable want to take credit for that, but we have been part of that equation to say, here are some things we can do structurally. Here are some ways we can view this problem and this challenge for students born into poverty to make a difference. And again, it's void of any quotas or specific race, gender. It really is focused on those that need it the most,
Mm.
of those lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And I think that's really empowered us to continue to lean into the work and not be at all, coy about who we're helping.
Mhm. And then you mentioned, first generation as another aspect of this where a lot of folks don't really know how to do college. They don't know what's out there. You even described it a little bit in your background. You also mentioned not just 4-year, but also 2-year, community colleges. There's lots of pathways out there. And I think frequently folks just don't know where to start. They don't know where the supports are. How do you think about that population, and how do you think about making the complexity of getting value out of higher ed maybe a little less difficult
Yeah,
for
that's
first
arduous
gen?
for students.
Yeah.
What we find, and you can read the statistics, but unfortunately, those support systems in schools, these educators that maybe at one time had a focus on how do I help my students get access to post-secondary pathways, they've been pulled into different things. There's a teacher shortage,
Hmm.
they're triaging mental health issues, and so you've got the high flyers whose parents are talking about higher education all the time, and it's just, hopefully for my kids, like going to college is non-negotiable. That's what you're doing, and we're going to find the right fit. I think there's a larger population in the middle that could kind of go either way.
Mhm.
And maybe the chance to work 40 hours a week and make a little bit of money as soon as they get out of high school while it seems appealing in the moment, it's a short-term fix. And that's where we come in and really try to stress to people, like, not to demean service industry jobs and those things, but it's hard to make a living wage and live comfortably and save money and remove that stress of living check to check if you're relying on that income or those type of jobs to do all the things you want to do in life.
Mhm.
So I think those are some of the support systems that we at Equitable Foundation, and I surely know many of the organizations that are part of the NCAN membership, they're really focusing students on, here are some opportunities, here are some pathways, here are some, there's a lot of dollars out there for first generation college students, and let us like help you uncrack the code to find those dollars. And listen, sometimes it's like we're planting these seeds. We may never see the trees that bloom from this for many years down the road, but I know it's the right thing to do. And, I'm convicted in that because, again, as I told you, I know how much going to college and getting a master's degree has elevated my career. And it would have been just as easy for me to graduate high school and work at the power company and, just all the things that happen in many rural communities. And I feel an obligation to use my voice, to use the voice of my colleagues that have gone to college to say, there are pathways for you to do this, that it will change your life. You don't see it today, but I'm here to tell you it can change your life.
Mhm. And then the other aspect of post-secondary pathways is landing that first good job on the other side, so you go to college and then you're ideally getting set up and equipped with the skills and the competencies and the connections that are going to get you into a career that will unlock some of the potential you've described even in your own journey. How do you think about that? How do you think about how higher ed can bridge folks into a career and, equip them for a future of work that's really complicated nowadays? We haven't talked about AI, but I did
Yeah,
it.
it's a great question. And, we often talk about no career path is perfectly linear or straight. I'm an example of that. And you talk to 10 people and but it is kind of fundamentally how you show up, how you comport yourself. Your reputation will often precede you, how you follow up. Those things matter. And we spend a lot of time talking to students about that. And then, generally speaking, when you get that first opportunity and you get to build your resume and put some things down that you can be proud of and you can articulate in a job interview, you've met people, people know that you're reliable, you're going to show up, you're a good teammate, you have good enthusiasm, you have good energy. That stuff goes such a long way. And we tell students that, often college, there's going to be classes just like there are in high school, just like there are in a professional setting. There's things that you prefer to do versus maybe things you're not as crazy about. But in the real world, you don't have the luxury to say, I'm only going to do the things I'm really fond of and I love doing, and the paperwork and the budgeting and the tough conversations. No, thanks. It doesn't work that way. And
Mhm.
part of college is, how do I show up even when it's not something that I'm overly enthusiastic about? How do I give my best effort? How do I
Mhm.
bring respect to the room or the subject matter? Those are things that really can start to separate you early in your career that set you up for opportunities in the future. And the last thing I'll say is, you talked about the networking. We do know through Raj Chetty's study how important those social networks are.
Mhm.
It's not as much about where you were born or the neighborhood, but often that is tied to your social networks.
Mhm.
And so that social capital we talk about is so important, is that finding people outside of your neighborhood that perhaps could be an inspiration for you, could perhaps make a phone call for you, create an opportunity for you. That is so important and something that we spend a lot of time talking about when we're in schools and in communities working with students.
Yeah. And we talked a lot about higher ed, but you mentioned a big part of your focus is also on K-12 and on K-12 educators. Is there anything that you want to highlight or showcase? A lot of our listeners are perhaps focused more on that than in the post-secondary space. And also, K-12 is what leads to higher ed. It's all connected, but what are your thoughts on the K-12 space and the work that Equitable is doing there?
It's such an important piece of our work. I mentioned, we support educators through their supplemental retirement programs, the 403B plan, the 457 plan. I think the role of an educator has really changed over the last, 5, 10 years. I saw a stat recently that there are fewer educators in this, 2019, 2023, obviously the pandemic, than before. And it seems to be, teacher shortages in any state, teacher pay, teacher retention. I'm really proud of the focus that we have in this space because it's unique. I don't see a lot of my peer companies solely focus on K through 12 educators. I think they'll all tell you that a vibrant, healthy, well organized school system is important for so many reasons, talent retention and just the vibrancy of a community. But I don't know that there are many as focused on the teacher. So I mentioned to you, whether it's through our partnering with programs to provide that professional development that's so important. We know the studies indicate that teachers that feel supported and develop are more likely to stay in the profession. The wellness piece over the last 2 years, we have a consultant, Leah Marone, and she provides workshops for educators locally, nationally through some of the partnerships we have. And we had 96% of the educators that took a survey after they'd been through the workshop say they felt more equipped to handle the daily stresses that come with being an educator and
Right.
all the hundreds of decisions they're being asked to make. I think about just this morning getting my kids out the door, in an hour time frame, the amount of questions you answer, you're like exhausted. Imagine being a teacher. They say, North 300, 400, like more than an air traffic controller. And so I want to see more communities, more companies thinking about just the role that they can play positively in a K through 12 educator's life that can just make that profession something that we all want it to be.
Yeah. And then what about advice for professionals? You mentioned a circuitous path to get to where you are, but a lot of our listeners are in a career in education. They've made that choice. That is their why. And, you've gotten to a really interesting vantage point here. What have you learned? And do you have anything you might be able to share with our listeners around charting that path?
Yeah, I feel so lucky. This wasn't something that I scripted. I'm able to provide for my family like I'd never really seen in my life. And I really think it is, how you treat people and what are those like non-negotiables or those core values of you as an individual that no matter what room you go into or what interaction you may have, like these are non-negotiable. And then from there, following up with people, showing up prepared, doing homework, doing the extra things. Those are things that have really helped me. And they don't have anything to do with me, having the most amazing SAT score or making, all A's in high school. Frankly, and I hope my kids don't listen to this, like I was the opposite of that. I didn't have good habits. There weren't a lot of consequence for my grades and things of that nature. But as I've matured, I've realized the importance that I need to put on how I show up, how I prepare, and how you differentiate yourself. And so those are some things from a core value standpoint that have really helped me no matter what the career and other people that I've seen be successful. It's like they hold on to these things that like, this is what I'm about and no one's going to take me off this track. And then I can be taught some of the more fine skills to a particular job or role. And I think anyone can do it. There's books, but, find a mentor, find someone that you look up to that you think, wow, if I could spend a little bit of time or comport myself like them, those are things you can learn from. I'm 46 years old. I presented just this past week to the president of our company, his leadership team presented virtually. And just 3 days later, the president was part of our board of directors for our company, was in a meeting. So I had the chance to present to him more intimately, with him in the audience more intimately this week than probably I have in 4 years combined. And I took the opportunity because I believe feedback is a gift. I sent him an email, obviously thanked him for his time, and he said, I would love your feedback, both from the virtual presentation and my in-person presentation, because I see you as someone that has like perfect comportment, great presence, great energy. Every time he presents, it's captive. I
Mhm.
want to be like him. And I'm not too, I'll be vulnerable and say that. And so I've asked him for feedback and he's not gotten back to me yet, but I can't wait for what he tells me and I'll take it to heart and I'll try to implement it. And
Mm.
we have to think like that. We always want to get better. It's the old saying, you've never arrived, you're always becoming. And I
Mm.
think if you have that mindset, that can help you go far in life.
Amazing advice from Jarian Kerekes, who's the president of the Equitable Foundation. It's been a wonderful conversation, Jarian. I touched on AI. You touched a little bit on wellness and, the anxious generation is something we talk about a lot nowadays. Are there any other things happening out there in the world outside of the specific parts of the education system that you're helping that you think are important, trends that you're tracking, any perspective you want to share on what's going on?
Yeah, I listened to a couple podcasts with Jonathan Haidt. You mentioned the
Yeah.
anxious generation. It's really interesting. And obviously, I'm a product of it too. But, my kids that don't have phones yet and will not until they're in high school, I hope. But it's just a different set of challenges. And you mentioned AI. I think there's some beautiful things by it. I think we have to be able to embrace change in order to get where we want to go. And
Mhm.
I've always been able to do that. And I think the more rigid or stuck in our ways one is, then that's when it becomes a bit more scary or something that you're leery of. But I've embraced AI, obviously carefully, but it's enhanced my productivity in some ways as it relates to my day to day work. And so I think that, as much as we can read about it and be open to it, those are things that are ultimately going to make us more productive and more efficient. So I'm excited about that. You asked just like other trends or things, obviously AI is top of mind for every business. How it affects my work in the foundation, obviously, I have to be cognizant of like, how can it make us more impactful? How can we leverage large language models to impact more students around completing their FAFSA and
Mhm.
supporting their students? Right now, it's very one to one, small group. Maybe there's a piece in the future where AI can help us scale that more broadly. I'm
Yep.
excited about that. I think in general, the other things you mentioned, the anxious generation is just when I think about, big macro trends, it's like what I want to see us get back to is just a little bit of, what you thought about as a kid, like people looking after each other and not so divisive and stuck in our ways and you got to yell and scream. I don't think that's going to get people anywhere. So I don't know if that starts in middle school or high school, but really leaning into the respect you have for people and the respect, and it's okay to have different opinions on things. It doesn't make one right or wrong, but we have to respect one another. And I think if we can try to focus on that as we go forward, that's something that I really am bullish about with my kids, leaning into that. And I think broadly in society that'll get us to a better place if we can think through that.
Yeah, I've heard it described as relational intelligence. Like we need to learn how to relate to each other and
Yeah,
think about how we teach that,
that's right.
especially as the AI starts to pick up on some of the other things that maybe were exclusively human in the past. It's been a wonderful conversation, Jerry. And as folks head back to the rest of their lives, do you have any takeaways, words of wisdoms to share as we conclude here?
Yeah, so I mentioned the National College Attainment Network. If you've benefited from a post secondary degree and the network that's ultimately provided you in your career, I'd implore you to take a look at National College Attainment Network, where you could plug in, where you could support. That would be one takeaway.
Mhm.
I think another thing is as you think about perhaps the benefits in your life or even the challenges that you've had, everyone has a story and we get busy in our day to day, professional, personally, if you have kids, those things, but where can you create space to maybe inspire or share your story, career path, even the challenges, the obstacles? Where could you make space to do that in your community through an organization, through a local school, whatever it may be? I think if more people are thinking, how do I give back and how do I spend time, roll up my sleeves and really get closer to some of the challenges, if everybody could have a mindset about that, I think that's going to get us to where we all ultimately want to go as a society quicker than not.
Amazing stuff. Jarian, thank you so much for joining me on today's show.
Michael, I've enjoyed the conversation. I look forward to it again. And thanks again for having me.
Jarian Kerekes is the president of the Equitable Foundation. We'll include links to the foundation and to NCAN, which he referenced in the show notes. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, tell your friends, do all the good things. This is Trending in Education.